Hey everybody, this is Will Joyner. If I were to describe an experience that I had that is similar to one of the cultural stumbling blocks that Barna outlines, it would have to be with an experience I had while working retail. I work at Five Below, and I get a wide variety of customers. Most of them are just there to buy stuff and get out as quickly as possible, but I always strive to make sure they have a good shopping experience, so I try to talk to all of them. And occasionally I'll run into a situation where there's a language barrier. Perhaps they're migrants or English isn't their first language, and I try to talk to them and I end up, I think, frustrating them, and that's the last thing I would want to do. And that reminded me of this quote from Barna, and it says, "The native inhabitants are likely to be ruled into the expectation that since the foreign person is dressed appropriately and speaks some of the language, he or she will also have similar nonverbal codes, thoughts, and feelings." And that came from page 323 of Barna's Stumbling Blocks in Intercultural Communication. That quote struck a chord with me because there are some times where I'll try to signal for a customer to come to the front of the line because there's a register open, and they won't understand me because English isn't their first language and they may not understand what I'm doing. And I tend to think that because they're all waiting in the same line, wanting to buy the same stuff, they'll be picking up on some of the cues, and I think that's selfish of me to think, because if it's not somebody's first language, I can definitely understand why they would have some trouble. So I think just striving to be as polite as possible would help me with that situation, so that everybody can buy what they need and they can tell that I'm willing to help them. So I think if I do that going forward, I'll be much more successful. Reflecting on my stumbling block, how can liberatory consciousness, described by Barbara Love, help us to be more culturally competent? The quote that I chose to help illustrate my point for that is, "The action component of a liberatory consciousness includes deciding what needs to be done and then seeing to it that action is taken." And that came from page 601 of Love's Developing a Liberatory Consciousness. The reason I picked that quote is because oftentimes if I feel like if there's going to be a language barrier between me and a customer, I'll be apprehensive in going up and talking to them because I don't want to bother them, and I don't want them to feel like I'm looking over their shoulder, because that's the last thing I would want them to feel like. And I think that this quote, deciding what needs to be done and then seeing to it that the action is taken, I think just going up and being as nice as possible and just showing that I'm there would be enough for them to know that if they do need help, they could come and get me, and I could help them do whatever they needed to do. I think that if I took that approach with my personal stumbling block, I could maybe become more culturally competent. Just speaking in general would help me out. Thinking back to the reading from last week by James Baldwin, as well as the readings on intersectionality, why is it important from a social justice perspective to be proactive when it comes to addressing cultural stumbling blocks? Okay. The quote I chose to use for my example for this one is, "Although the term was originally used to describe how race and gender could intersect as forms of oppression, intersectionality has broadened to encompass a number of additional social factors: sexual orientation, nationality, class, disability, and others." And that came from page 1 of IMBA's Intersectionality. I think this quote struck a chord with me because it talked about different social factors: sexual orientation, nationality, class, disability, and other factors. I think that being socially, or not socially, but culturally competent could help me in my day-to-day life, because, sorry, I'm looking at my script while I'm also trying to give my answer. I think it's important to be proactive because it shows that you're willing to help out and that you want to help out. You don't want to be closed off, and in my experience, that's the last thing I'd want to do. I think as peace workers, it's vital for us to try to understand wide ranges of people. Like the quote says, no matter their sexuality, nationality, creed, if they have any disabilities. I think that simply learning about their culture will go a long way when it comes to addressing cultural stumbling blocks. If you research everything you can and you try to remain as competent as possible, I'm sure that stumbling blocks could be avoided. I'm not saying that they could be completely avoided. I'm just saying that if you try to be as aware as possible, you could go a long way in preventing any, I don't want to say embarrassing moments, but it could make you seem more sure of yourself. And finally, how can the skills discussed in LeBaron and Pillay, conflict across cultures, help us to overcome cultural stumbling blocks? Okay. The quote I chose for that, it had to do with the road trip example that LeBaron and Pillay were talking about. And it said, do you remember how you prepared for these possibilities? You may have plotted alternate routes, made sure your car was ready, invited a friend to share the driving, recorded your favorite music, or packed a picnic lunch to have along the way. These steps could have increased your positive experience of the trip, and that came from page 111 of LeBaron and Pillay's Conflict Across Cultures. I chose to use that clip because it talked about preparedness, and I think that, as I mentioned in the last question, if you're constantly researching and striving to know as much as you can about other cultures, you can it can help you overcome cultural stumbling blocks simply because you'll know something. You don't have to know everything, but it'll allow you to put the people you're talking to at ease, and it'll show that you're willing to work with them and that you want to help them. And I think that would go a long way. All right, that's pretty much all I have. Thank you for listening.